Hey, Dr. Jon Finn here. Welcome to the Habit Mechanic podcast. Right now, you can get my new best-selling book, Train Your Brain for the AI Revolution, at tougherminds.co.uk. The digital book, audiobook, and physical book are all available at a special price that you won't find anywhere else. Hello, Habit Mechanics. It's Dr. Jon Finn here. Welcome to the second episode in our shorter podcast series where we're sharing stories about people I think are habit mechanics. It's a really topical one today, and I'm really pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague, Andrew Whitelam. Andrew, how are you?
Yes, I'm very good, John. Great to be here. And it is topical, as you say, because we're recording this in the build-up to the coronation of King Charles III in 2023. But we're going to look back in this podcast to the coronation and some other activities of King George VI in the 1940s in Britain, because his life and part of his reign were the subject of a film called The King's Speech. And King Charles III, when he's crowned at the end of this week, is no doubt going to be giving a few speeches. And of course, the King's Speech, as many of people will know, chronicles important addresses made by George VI when he was suffering from a pretty severe speech impediment. But without giving too much away, if you haven't seen the film, he was able to draw on the services of a fantastic speech therapist who helped him overcome this. And this forms a great story and a great example that you're able to use in the Habit Mechanic book. And I know you've drawn out some great lessons from that, John.
Yeah, so this is in chapter 24 of the book, which is the Performing Under Pressure chapter. And we spotlight how the practice George VI did in the build-up to the coronation speech allowed him to change his brain so that he was able to overcome those speech impediment challenges. And we really dig into these very specific things his therapist was asking him to do and why that was beneficial. And it connects to something that we call the T-TAP model. So I'm going to fully unpack that right now using a section from the audiobook. So this is more about how King George VI overcame his stutter and ended up changing his habits.
Practicing to perform. Lessons from King George VI. To perform under pressure, there are several factors you need to consider when practicing. The following story will explain them to you. The film, The King's Speech, focuses on the true story of King George VI's stutter and his relationship with his speech therapist, Lionel Logue. The basis of the film was hundreds of diary entries, documents, and letters written about the unusually close relationship between the king and this man. Lionel Logue was not the first speech therapist asked to help the king. In fact, George VI had seen so many and had experienced so much failure trying to cure his stutter that he had given up hope and did not even want to meet Mr. Logue. Eventually, the king agreed. In the film, at the end of their first consultation, the speech therapist declared, "I can cure you, but it will need a tremendous effort by you. Without that effort, it can't be done." Logue insisted that the king needed to engage in regular, focused practice, meaning you focus hard, make mistakes, and use feedback about your mistakes to get better. One of the central focuses of the film is the king's coronation at Westminster Abbey, where he needed to speak publicly in a high-pressure situation. According to the film, Logue didn't just ask the king to practice his speech at home or in Logue's Harley Street office. They went to Westminster Abbey where the coronation would take place. He also made the king sit in the coronation chair and talk through the speech in real time, in the same way he would need to during the highly important state occasion. Logue also played the part of the Archbishop of Canterbury, so the king could replicate the exchanges between the two. Logue was exposing the king to 5 conditions that would be present at the real coronation. This wouldn't be the case if the king had simply practiced the speech in his private rooms. First, the therapist was allowing the king to experience what it would be like to perform the speech in Westminster Abbey, so he could become comfortable with the environment. Second, by asking him to sit in the coronation chair, Logue was trying to make the king's practice as similar as possible to the real performance. Third, by asking the king to practice his responses and speech in Westminster Abbey's coronation chair, Logue was allowing him to experience and practice managing the activation levels he would experience on Coronation Day. Fourth, by playing the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Logue was trying to make the task, performing the speech, as similar as possible in rehearsals as it would be in the real ceremony. Fifth, and connected to the last point, Logue tried to make the timing of the task as similar as possible to the real thing. This meant the king had to speak with a rhythm and a pace that would make it more difficult for him to stutter, allowing him to practice at the same speed he would have to perform at on Coronation Day. Lionel Logue's detailed training plan for the king appears to have paid off. George VI completed his speech at Westminster Abbey without a single stutter. The same practice strategies were used to help the king deliver other powerful and important speeches throughout his reign, including during the difficult days of the Second World War. Firing the same neural circuitry. Our knowledge of these events is drawn largely from a film, but although we do not have a first-hand account, it is safe to assume that Lionel Logue's techniques were very effective at firing the same neural circuitry in the king's brain during practice that would need to fire for him to make successful public speeches. This is perhaps why he succeeded in helping the king where so many had failed. For your practice to be successful, it needs to trigger the same neural circuits you will need to use when performing under pressure. Imagine you are rehearsing an important presentation and consider the following points. Environment. First, think about the environment in which your presentation is taking place. Are you familiar with the room? The more comfortable you feel in that environment, the less likely it will have a negative impact on your performance. Activation. Next, consider activation. What is your ideal activation level when you are giving a great presentation? Replicate that same level when you're practicing your presentation. It is also worth thinking about how the presentation environment might affect your activation. If you think you will feel nervous during the presentation, and therefore your activation will be high in the presentation, you might want to try to replicate this when practicing. Physical elements. Next, consider the physical elements connected to giving the presentation. When you give your presentation, will you be sitting at your desk? Or will you be standing up? How will you be dressed? Replicate these factors in your practice as closely as possible. Tasks. Then, consider the tasks you perform during the presentation. Will you be reading your presentation from a script? Will you be presenting without notes? Will you be using a clicker to move through your slides? Practice what you will actually be doing in the real presentation. Timing. Finally, consider timing. What time of day is your presentation? How much time will you have? How much time will you have on each slide? Practice using the same presentation timings. TTAP Learning Framework. To recap, you need to consider the following factors during your practice to prepare you to perform to your potential under pressure. 1. The performance environment. 2. your optimal performance activation level. 3. The physical elements of the performance. 4. The tasks you will be completing. 5. The performance timings. To make it easier to remember these 5 factors, I created the acronym TTAP Learning. T for task, E for environment, T for timing, A for activation, and P for physical. By activating all these factors in your practice, you will be firing the same or similar neural circuitry in your brain that you will need to fire during your actual performance. Test. If it is helpful, write down what TTAP stands for to test your memory.
Well, that was a fascinating extract from The Habit Mechanic, talking about the film The King's Speech and the story of George VI overcoming a speech impediment with the help of Lionel Logue, the speech therapist. And John, as you said, it provides a fantastic example and a fantastic story that we can use to learn more about how our brains work and how we can perform under pressure. You obviously included it in the book for that specific purpose. And in the chapter, you talk about the idea of functionally equivalent practice, practicing in the way you're going to perform. And you've developed a specific model to help people do this. It's an abbreviation called TTAP. Tell us more about that, if you would, please.
Yeah, so the first thing that I got really interested in academically within the field of performance psychology was imagery. I did my undergraduate dissertation on that, and also my master's dissertation. And I actually went to study, the university I went to study my master's at was because there was a guy there who was a world leading expert in imagery, with the neuroscience of imagery. And his own PhD work, he developed a model called the PETLET model, which was all about this idea of functional equivalence. So that if you wanted to optimize the way that you used imagery, it was about getting as many of the circuits firing in your brain that were going to be fired in the actual performance. So if you take the example of taking a penalty, we all know that the England football team have a publicly famous record of not doing so well in penalty shootouts. And if we imagine how we practice penalty shootouts, it's very difficult to replicate the kind of pressure that you're going to be under on the training ground, or rather the pressure you're going to be under at the end of a semi-final or whatever in a World Cup or European Championships on the training ground. But there are steps you can take to make it more functionally equivalent. I know, for example, one of the old Watford managers, a guy called Adi Boothroyd, who would get the home fans to stay behind in the stadium at the end of games, and he would ask his players to practice taking penalties, that type of thing. So I just got really interested in that. I did a couple of actually peer-reviewed pieces of research during my masters all around this area, including where we were looking at the role of what we call mirror neurons. But then I created something called the pre-shot training system, which was designed to make it easier for golfers to practice firing the same neurons in their practice that they would need to fire on the golf course under pressure. And that's really what the PETLET idea, the TTAP idea is based on. When I watched the film The King's Speech, I thought this is really interesting in terms of how, I suppose, the whole thread of The King's Speech is the slightly unusual techniques Lionel Logue, the therapist, is asking the king to do, the quirkiness of it, but it's not quirky for as a joke. It's actually because they're very powerful ways of practicing. Lionel Logue wouldn't have understood the neuroscience because no one did back then. But actually, the value he was providing was because I would argue, he was getting the same neurons to fire in King George VI's brain during practice that he would need during the actual coronation.
Yeah, and it's perhaps people might think it's slightly eccentric, but this was a case of creating the same sort of environmental conditions. I think in the film, Lionel Logue even pretended to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Is that right? So it was a true as close as possible to the situation that the king, or I suppose any other performer, would find themselves in.
Yeah, this is it. So if we have a framework of the rules of functional equivalence, if you like, which is what the TTAP model is designed to do, then we can compare and contrast how we're currently preparing to perform under pressure with that model and the things that might be more beneficial to do. And at the end of chapter 24, we have something called the performance hack plan, which is a series of self-reflections about how you currently perform under pressure. You can use that for your golf. You can use it for your exam performance. You can use it for giving a presentation, so that you've got a better sense of how you can properly practice to give yourself the best chance of actually performing under pressure.
Well, it's a fantastic tool. It's a fantastic story, Jon. And I know that performing under pressure is something many people are interested in, as you say, in their work and in their lives. And this use of the example of the King's Speech really brings it to life. So thank you for highlighting that in this podcast for us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to these short podcasts too, and leave us a review if you can, and look out for more in this series of short podcasts. And we'll be back very soon with the full Habit Mechanic podcast. Jon, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, well, let's see how the King gets on at the weekend performing under pressure. I'm sure he'll nail it. Remember, wherever you are with your current abilities, we know that we can get better with practice. But not all practice is equivalent. Some practice is much more efficient and effective than other forms, and we really dig into that within the Habit Mechanic. So if you're interested in how to supercharge your learning, read chapter 24. Also read chapter 26, read chapter 5. We can change, we can do better. I know it feels difficult, but remember, or it can feel difficult, but remember, it's worth persisting, because you're only ever one habit away. Thanks for listening to the Habit Mechanic podcast. If you liked it, please subscribe and tell someone else about one of the ideas or insights that you found most interesting.